Hey people, it's Niles talking. I would like to thank Mr. Imhotep because I got this idea from one of his comment sections. So I'm going to leave the links to him so you can see his stuff. Anyway, this is from Vice, Fighting the Shackles of Slavery, Kicking and Knocking in the Antebellum South. African slaves in the American South continued their martial arts traditions by fighting, as sport, ritual, and self-defense. The horrors of slavery in America cannot be understated, nor can the irreparable damage to a culture be something that is ignored or brushed aside. The men, women, and children who were sold against their will and taken across the vast ocean to a new world, only to be starved, worked to the bone, assaulted, and killed. There is no space to excuse slavery or to talk about plantations where slaves were treated well, because without the right of autonomy, a person cannot be free. Certainly there were other groups in the United States who lived in abject poverty and whose existence was terrible, but it is inappropriate to attempt an equivalence between the life of a poor white man and the reality of an African slave who was roundly dehumanized and demoralized for the benefit of white and upper and middle class society. The atrocities perpetrated upon the enslaved African community are so vast and so varied that one article cannot suffice to explore them adequately. This article instead focusing on how the Middle Passage did not completely destroy the culture, the history, the practices, the customs, and traditions of the African men, women, and children who were enslaved. History books frequently reduce the lives of slaves to harder experiences, focusing on dates and wars, and ignoring the everyday life of the men, women, and children who lived as slaves in the United States. But it would be another form of erasure if we did not recognize the significant impact that a wide range of African traditions had upon American culture. There is no American culture without black culture. Each person brought with him or her customs of food, music, art, and dance specific to their community, creating an amalgam of traditions that would eventually be reduced to that of a singular representation of Africanism. Despite the horror of slavery, many of the newly imported African slaves were able to retain aspects of their culture and pass it down through the generations, creating a new Creole community with shared various traditions and customs. In Fighting for Honor, African scholar T.J. Obi reveals that slave routes did not randomly distribute Africans, but rather the combination of trading patterns and preferences of European planters in the Americas for laborers of specific African ethnicities tended to lump together large numbers of captive Africans from certain areas into particular colonies in the Americas. Therefore, there might be a large majority of slaves from a specific community or a tribe ensconced in a particular plantation. The concentration of slaves from a shared background aided in the collective remembrance of their cultures, beliefs, and practices. In South Carolina, there was an influx of slaves imported from Central Africa who brought with them their own martial arts traditions. Out of this amalgamous collective of various communities and tribes, the art of kicking and knocking was born, a fighting sport that consisted of kicks, strikes, and headbutting. Obi argues that the style of fighting most often employed and practiced by African slaves, wrestling, and the art of kicking and knocking had greater utility for that population than traditional English boxing. The Angolan practice of headbutting became the knocking in this new composite style, where fighters would either headbutt as part of the large kicking and knocking style, or isolate that attack by grabbing each other by the ears and slamming their heads together until one of the fighters submitted. The knock of kicking and knocking is purportedly from the sound the fighters' heads made when they crashed into each other. Kicking, meanwhile, grew in part from the Ngolo tradition of foot sweeps and high inverted kicks. Kicking and knocking was practiced as either sport or ritual dance, but both techniques, along with wrestling, could be used in be hidden in ceremonial dance and basic defense against rivals, slave hunters, or foremen. In a 1938 interview with the Federal Writers Slave Narrative Project, former slave Will Adams remembered some of his experiences growing up on a Texas plantation. During Christmas, the plantation owner would host a large party where the slaves once were able to have their fill of food and drink. Adams recalled the master would instruct two of the slaves to wrestle each other, saying that our sport and dances was big sport for the white folks. Mr. Adams went on to explain that the slaves not only fought each other, they fought white men too. In slavery time, grown white boys would come to play in wrestle with the N-words wood. I'm not saying that word. African wrestling and enslaved populations came from a variety of traditions, including Nigerian of Mugba and Senegalese art of Lam, and often featured leg wrapping techniques which marked its distinction from the collar and elbow practiced by the growing Irish immigrant population in the U.S. African wrestling took the form of sport and play. In many circumstances, slaves would wrestle each other too, as Frederick Douglass wrote, win laurels and display their physical prowess to young women in the audience. Douglass noted sports were encouraged by plantation owners, including wrestling and boxing, which Douglass deemed wild and low sports peculiar to semi-civilized people, but that rational enjoyment was not. Douglass felt that by encouraging the slaves to participate in low sports, there would be no room for them to explore more important pursuits, such as reading, writing, or perhaps planning a rebellion. NBA, anyone? He explained that plantation owners encouraged fighting because it was among the most effective means in the hands of the slave owner. keeping down the spirit of insurrection. While African slaves brought their martial arts traditions with them, the South was becoming enamored with boxing. In the early 18th century, wealthy families would send their sons to England and other parts of Europe for their education. Although young men from the North and South made the journey to England, the vast majority of them were Southern, due in most part to the surplus of wealth found in that plantation-rich part of the country. The young men would be schooled in academics, art, and culture, of course, and would typically sow their wild oats amidst the vast cultural diversions of the old country. British pugilism at the time was just entering the golden age of fighting when the working class and the elite both pursued the sweet science. Young American men of a certain personality type learned to box from British pugilism instructors and took their knowledge back with them to the more puritanical America. But they found their choice of opponents was lacking. They turned to a seemingly abundant source of punching bags. Or so they thought. If the young Southern gentlemen thought they would find easy targets in the men they kept as slaves, they were very wrong. This is a great deal of conjecture as to how prolific and violent boxing matches were on plantations. To a certain extent, it did not make sense economically for plantation owners to put their slaves up for brutal fights that could ostensibly damage the slave or reduce his ability to work. Some historians argue unilaterally that types of fights a la Django Unchained did not take place. However, there are anecdotal accounts of brawls between slaves and matches where slaves were forced to fight each other to the death for a chance at freedom. These accounts may be unsubstantiated, but that does not mean they did not occur. After all, it would not have been in the best interest of slave owners to promote these fights in any type of publication, nor would it have been wise for written accounts to get in the hands of abolitionists. Dash O.B. recognized two forms of contest in the antebellum South: matches between slaves on the slave plantation for fun and matches between slaves from different plantations for the purpose of gambling. According to an account from former slave turned abolitionist Henry Bibb, the fights were not in the English this person does not write very well English prize fighting, but rather in the kicking and knocking, reduced to a certain extent the damage upon each of the participants. It is undeniable that slaves box and wrestle each other, but given the circumstances, it's not likely they fought to the death or to the maiming or disfiguring of the opponent frequently. But African slaves certainly fought each other and fought white men as well. Sometimes they fought the very men who enslaved them. The slaves who did fight in style of English pugilism, especially in the late 18th century and early 19th century, may have had more opportunity to change their circumstances. But the United States, even in the North, was not the ideal place for them to showcase their talents. As was revealed in last week's article on Jewish, Irish, and African immigrant populations in England, African men had opportunities to fight and create careers for themselves in Britain, and so the few African American pugilists who succeeded in the U.S. found ways to move to England. Bill Richmond and Tom Molyneux were both born slaves, and after becoming free, moved to New York and then to England. It's unclear in the records just how both men went from slaves to freemen, despite conjecture they earned it by their pugilistic endeavors. Richmond was a freeman before he was employed by the Duke of Northumberland and taken to England with his new master to work on his own as a cabinet maker and boxer. There are legends completely unsubstantiated and embellished over time that claim Molyneux won his freedom after his master won $100,000 in a bet on Tom's success, and a version of this could be true. The most important takeaway from both Richmond and Molyneux's story is that despite their dominance as pugilists in the United States, given the opportunity, they left as soon as they could for better lives in England. Even when African men and women were technically free in the United States, their lives were still harsh and tainted by racism and hatred in a country that neither they nor their ancestors would have chosen for their own. African boxers were not the only ones to set sail for England. White American pugilists also saw England as the preeminent location for aspiring champions at their departure, along with African fighters left the United States bereft of some of the best talent. Meanwhile, those men and women still enslaved in the South sought to create their own fighting traditions carved out of the customs of their ancestors. Fighting sports in enslaved populations in the United States function as ritual, as performance, and as communal bonding. The continuation of African traditions in their current dire circumstances provide the African men and women with a chance to remember their history through song, dance, and sport. Certain fighting sports in the South were interestingly more recreational, new brutal forms such as the rough and tumble or kicking and knocking, while the North was the epicenter of American prize fighting. Despite their training of these Southern gentlemen, the fights in the parts of the world were not a reflection of English culture, but rather the fluid set of styles that reflected the men who practiced them. The rough and tumble was that of the poor white trappers and lumbermen who had zero regard for their own looks, and kicking and knocking was the preview of the African slave intent on maintaining some form of cultural continuity. Despite their circumstances in this strange country, they both needed and despised them. As with any group of people who practiced a martial art historically, fighting sports functions as a means of self-protection when a trained individual found himself or herself in dire circumstances. Many African slaves called upon their training when faced with atrocities to be perpetuated upon themselves or their family members. Stories of slaves fighting aggressive overseers populate nearly every slave narrative, although, as Dash Obi notes, given the oppressive nature of racial slavery, a few could respond this way to every insult, but many slaves simply drew a line at physical violence. Women who were enslaved frequently put their cultural martial arts in as training to use in order to defend themselves on all sides from rape. Female slaves would practice wrestling as part of the ritual performance and contest, and these techniques were put to good use when faced with rape or brutality. Silva Dubois, an African American woman whose mistress routinely assaulted her, took her revenge by beating her mistress so severely the white people who watched were so in shock that Sylvia managed to flee her oppressor and escape her bonds. The results of slavery are far-reaching and have a significant, lasting, and insidious impact on American culture today. There's a tendency to think of slavery as the complete dehumanization of the enslaved, but that misconception does not recognize the communities that out of trauma and necessities people create in order to maintain their humanity. Sharing traditions and customs across ethnic lines through generations, the African slave population in the American South retained a sense of self, both collective and individual. The collective trauma of slavery generated a need for African fighting arts to endure and to grow, and today the many styles of martial arts practiced in the US and abroad contain elements of slave traditions, although they are not given their due credit. We often equate fighting sports to either a European or Asian tradition, which ignores the vast history of martial arts across all people, even those that were subjugated and victimized. Fighting sports exist currently and historically in every culture, crossing boundaries of race, religion, and gender, but we can never and shall never forget that the legacy of so many of our martial arts were formed out of necessity and created through the blood, the sweat, and the lives of those who came before us. I hope you've enjoyed that. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. I'll leave this article in the description. If you like the sports channel, you might go fund me there as well. If you like to follow me on Instagram, I'll leave that there as well. And if you want to buy one of my t-shirts, I'll leave that link as well. Peace.